Dr. Greer, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. I'm very grateful to be back on. I know it was
Thank you.
short notice, and happy birthday to you.
Thank you so
And
much. And I want to also welcome onto the show the listeners that I know are coming in, ministers of President Putin, one of whom is my very good friend, the president of the Academy of Geopolitical Problems, General Avishov, and also he's the doctor of historical sciences. This will be very relevant to these people, this particular information. The president and professor of the Academy of Geopolitical Problems, the president of the Association of the Ecology of the Unknown, which I now hold a position in Moscow. I'll tell people about in a future show because you have so much to share today that I don't want to take the time, but I also want to welcome listener Dr. Timur Butulov. He's also president of the group of companies known as Conti. And we have many members and many associates of the Academies of Natural Sciences that Dr. Timur is associated with, and people around the world listening in who are very concerned about not only geopolitical problems, but the natural sciences, all the sciences. Dr. Greer has been the champion of the Disclosure Project issue. Many of you know I was a witness in the Disclosure Project in May 2001, but he has also produced amazing videos, books, documentaries. He'll tell you all about this. And in relation to something that he would like to reveal today that is so relevant, you know that I have been putting steps together to support the work that I've been doing, especially in this most recent trip that was so amazing in Moscow, to support the Treaty on the Prevention of the Placement of Weapons in Outer Space. Each of the shows that are archived on AmericanFreedomRadio.com add up to a full picture. And this is one of the culmination points that's such a good example of cover-up, of what the directions are that we can go into and what each of us can do. So again, welcome, Dr. Greer. We'd like for this to be your show and to really go on with everything that you can possibly squeeze into this short period of time.
yes, well, it's going to be a full show, and I think I want to give an overview of what we're going to be covering. Many of you may have seen the documentary series that featured this little creature who was found in the Atacama Desert of Chile in 2003 and by a treasure hunter. And this was then subsequently taken to Spain with no knowledge of ours. We were not involved in that. It's become a big controversy that it was taken out of Chile as an antiquity. It is estimated to have lived around 100 to 130 years ago in this remote, dry desert area that has a very harsh environment. It gets very hot during the day, extremely cold at night in the winters, called the Atacama Desert. And when I first saw it was in 2009. I was in near Barcelona doing a presentation to about 2,000 people, and someone came up to me and said, there's a man here who very much needs to speak to you. And I was shown a photograph of this being. I immediately knew that it was something unusual. And we met. I investigated it. I held it personally. It fits in my hand. It's 6 inches long. So I have big hands. Nevertheless, it fit in the palm of my hand. And I was frankly rather astonished. Being a medical doctor, I'm an emergency and trauma doctor. I've seen virtually every kind of human, and I've delivered a couple of hundred infants. And to see something this small that was so perfect and yet did not look human, it certainly got my curiosity going. But we really weren't given access to it medically until about 2012. And in September 2012, I'm the principal investigator on this project who went over there, and with some assistance, we got some CAT scans, x-rays, which we will also show you well, we can't show we can't show those here, but we have them on our website at seriousdisclosure.com. So if you want to see those, you just go to seriousdisclosure.com and look under the evidence part, and you'll see there's a whole section of the CAT scans and x-rays and photographs of this little being. So you can look at those as we're speaking today. What happened is that we wanted to get some studies on the DNA, so we clipped the anterior right lateral ribs, which, by the way, this little being has 10 ribs instead of 12, which is unusual. It has 4 skull bones instead of 6 like humans have. All kinds of anomalies with the skeletal structure. Just so you know, it also has some fascia or connective tissue that had dried out. It was very desiccated, and it had dried out, but you could still see where there was some connective tissue, a cartilaginous type material. In the skull, we were able to extract some of the meninges, the lining of the brain, and what have you. There's no question it's an actual organism that had lived out in the desert at some point, and we simply didn't know what it was. Now, for the record, because it's been misrepresented in the New York Times in the last week, on March 22nd, this fraudulent report came out, and I'll get to that in a moment. But it's been misrepresented that we were calling it an alien. If you go through everything that's in the Sirius documentary and everything that I have ever written and said, and we have a YouTube video presentation on this that's had 1 million views already, I never called it an alien or an ET. I said it's unusual and we do not know what it is, and we need to have it investigated independently and thoroughly. Well, around this time, a man named Gary Nolan, who is the Harris Chair professor at Stanford University with a PhD, and his focus is immunology and genetics and what have you. And he has dozens of postdocs who work under him. I've been in his lab, reached out, and he had informed me that he had had an ET contact experience personally, that Dr. Nolan had had contact with ETs, and that he was very interested in the subject, and that he would be happy to be sort of an honest broker to do the genetic work on it. Many people in the last week have said, how did you get mixed up with Stanford, which has SRI and all these other entities that are connected to covert government contracting? Didn't you know that they would submarine this? I said, well, I trusted Gary Nolan to do a good job because I felt he was sincere, and he had the credentials, and he also had the equipment that's very, very specialized to do the genetic studies on this specimen, which we knew was quite unusual. Well, during this time period, but we of course, under forensic sterile field, for example, like you would in the emergency department in a rape kit or a murder case or a stabbing or a shooting, we took the evidence and did it under forensic chain of command. It never came out from our control and possession until it was handed off to Dr. Nolan. And Gary took it then into his lab to do the genetic research. He immediately was very excited about what he found. He found that there was almost 10% of the genetic material not matching to humans. Now, people go, well, what does that mean? A monkey, if you go to your zoo and go look at what a chimpanzee looks like, or a gorilla, they are 98 to 98.5% identical to humans. So this becomes a very strange now, because that is a very low percentage of matching. Because I don't know the specifics, but a fruit fly has a large number of their genes the same as humans, et cetera, and so on. A guinea pig has a very large number of genes the same as humans. So for it to be less matching, even if it was 98% matching to a human, this would be very, very unusual. And so he said, well, this is something very anomalous. And he had shared this information with a man who has asked to remain anonymous at this time because of the academic scandal that this has become. Now, let me be very clear. The man that I am referring to, I have checked his bona fides. He is one of the top geneticists in the world. He was asked to actually work with Watson, Watson and Crick, who discovered the DNA molecule, at Cold Spring Harbor in Long Island. And at one point, his own PhD supervisors were Nobel Prize winners. He has a PhD in genetics from Caltech and literally invented the crystallography of DNA and has done pioneering research for decades and is a man of enormous stature in the DNA field. He contacted me this past Sunday morning and said, this is an academic scandal of the first order of magnitude. And just to give you an idea of how far off the paper, which is in this journal, Genome Research. Now, this is one of the most prestigious scientific journals in the world. This paper appeared March 22nd. Now, that is a peer-reviewed journal. Now, what that means in America is that it's supposed to have gone through the review of people competent to examine the data and also to reach any conclusions so that it could be accepted or not accepted. When I spoke to this world-renowned geneticist, he said, first thing out of his mouth was, any peer review of this paper that Nolan had done would have received a 0 ranking, 0 grade, because he did no controls. He did no proper analysis, and it slipped through and got put in this prestigious journal, and now it's been front page news on the New York Times and CNN and BBC and every journal in the world, claiming that this is a deformed human girl that was an aborted fetus, and that it had 7 sudden magical genes never known before that caused the deformity. Now, one of the things he wrote, and this we just received in the last hour from this world-renowned geneticist, and I want to read this. Nolan says that the Chilean mummy has lots of random chance mutations which affected 7 different genes for bone development all at once. If such mutations were really random, as he says, then practically every other gene of similar DNA length would have been mutated, meaning at least 1/4 to 1/2 of the 30,000 genes in the human genome. Quite obviously, if this were the case, then the fertilized embryo would never have been able to divide even once. Even an inherited single gene disorder, one gene mutated out of 30,000 can cause serious developmental problems. Now, this is dispositive. This statement by itself pretty much shows the complete incompetence and error of this report that has now gone all over the world saying the case is closed on this. Now, I think that this should be of great concern, even if you're not interested in the UFO and ET issue. The corruption of scientific research and the creation, of junk, the creation of junk science, which has begun to come out through more and more of these peer-reviewed journals, has become an epidemic. We have a paper talking about this from the New Republic, where it was an overview where it said that 14 of the 14 most important referenced medical papers in recent times were never made their way into peer-reviewed journals and were rejected, while there were all these others that were getting in that were junk science. So there's something very seriously wrong in general. But in this case, the system broke down completely at Cold Spring Harbor, the birthplace of Watson and Crick, where the DNA molecule was first discovered, and for which, of course, they got the Nobel Prize. and their flagship journal, Genome Research. So this should be of concern to any scientist listening, and any layperson listening needs to be very worried about this. Of what does this mean in terms of the veracity of what we consider truth coming out of academia and scientific research. Now, somewhere in that period between October of 2012 and 2013, Nolan did before he'd even done all the research, did a 180-degree turn, and by the time the Sirius film came out, was said to the public that it was a deformed human. That even before he had run all the studies, he had reached his conclusion. And this, of course, caused the entire release of the film Sirius to be not covered in the mainstream media. We had interviews lined up for The View, for Fox News and others, but his statement alone pretty much terminated the release of that film Sirius, which was part of the Disclosure Project effort. And I wondered, what in the world is going on here? I knew something terrible had happened. We'll get to this in a moment. So it's also important for people to understand that at the same time that we were researching this, we were getting the clinical data in. Now, what I mean by clinical data is Dr. Ralph Lockman, who is a professor at Stanford, was asked to do the research on this as a medical doctor who's taking care of many of the syndromes we're talking about. And Dr. Lockman's report, which is also on the website, I'm not seeming to be able to find it here where I thought it might be, but his report very clearly stated that this was a 6 to 8 year old child. Now, what does that mean? It means a 6 to 8 year old child that's 6 inches tall. Let me repeat this. And had been up walking around. Anthropologists in Europe, where there was some remaining tissue on the foot and heel, had said that this was also some sort of creature that had been up and walking around. Then we find in this report from Gary Nolan that they're saying that it was a fetus that was aborted that never touched the earth and was never up and around. So the report in the journal shows that this is, and I want to show an x-ray, a picture of me holding up this creature. That's me holding up, and you can see the density of the bones. It's so tiny that the whole being can be in what would normally be just a small view of one bone. And he also noted that all the different abnormalities, the fact that it had 4 skull bones instead of 6, the fact that it had only 10 ribs instead of 12, and yet it was a perfectly symmetrical being. It was not deformed. It was not like you would, if you go and Google, dysplasias of the bone and deformations of the bone, it was perfectly symmetrical. And so what we began to realize is that this was a global situation. Global meaning the entire being was different from a human. And in his report, which I have here, and you can see his signature, I don't know if you can see all of it, and I don't expect you to be able to read it, but what he says very clearly, it has 10 ribs, it's 6 to 8 years of age, and that it is a genuine specimen. In other words, this is not a hoax or a model or something like that. So now this begins to be more and more worrisome. The information began to pour in clinically from around the world about other creatures like this. And I shared with Nolan that there was one found in Russia. That's why I wanted to do this on your show. And the Russian creature was, look at the back of the head of this one, was 1996, and it looked very much the same in terms of its skeletal structure. Here's one that shows the top of the head almost like a helmet-like structure that you can see, and even to the point that one part overlaps another and comes to a little twist or a point. And this was noted to be so similar to the Atacama humanoid that we got the genetics on. Now, the story behind this one was not only given to Gary Nolan, one of his PhD or postdoc students found all the evidence on the internet for it and remarked about how much it looked the same. And we have that correspondence from Dr. Nolan to them. So one of the things you need to understand about this, it says that the Russian one was eventually taken by the FSB. We need help in Russia relocating this, which had been the KGB. But prior to that, it was found, had 3 genetic studies that were done that showed that it did not have human genetics. However, it was later done by a state lab that declared it was a female human fetus. The same cover story as you see in the Gary Nolan report that's in the Human Genome. It's very curious. When I read this the other day, I thought, how strange that it started out the same way and it ended up the same way. It started out that people were doing real research on the Russian creature, and ended up being just an ordinary human that had all these deformities. Now, the story behind that is that it's an area of Russia where there are a lot of UFOs seen going in and out of the mountains, and that area is noted to be a hot spot and has been for centuries of UFOs. Interestingly, where the Atacama humanoid was found, I just got this photograph from the Atacama Desert, is also an area that's noted. I don't know if you can see the photograph or not. Can you see it, Carol?
Yes, we can see it pretty well. And
okay.
Of course, you'll have links to it, but it's quite amazing.
Yeah, and this is a daytime disc classic over the Atacama Desert. And so the native peoples of that area, of both Russia and Chile, now these are separate continents, separate hemispheres, have seen these UFOs and have seen these small creatures, which apparently are just a little over a foot tall when they're fully developed. The specimen that we call the Atacama one, was apparently only a child of 6 to 8 years, or the equivalent in human years of 6 to 8 years. Look again at the skull and the overlapping bone of the one in Russia. And then you go back and you look at the skull structure, if you're on our website, of the one that we have from the Atacama Desert. There's a remarkable, and they both have 4 skull bones, whereas humans have 6. Now, Dr. Nolan had stated emphatically, if there were 2 of these anywhere in the world, it would rule out a spontaneous mutation of a human fetus. That there's no way that you're going to have 2 of these that are 1 in a quadrillion chance. And yet he was given all of this clinical data and still came up with a genetic report that has been accepted by this peer-reviewed journal that says the case is closed. It's a deformed human Chilean girl that was a fetus. Well, this geneticist who has been doing this work with us has, and his remarks are somewhere, I will get them in a minute. The geneticist has stated that and I just want to emphasize some of these points that he made. When he first contacted us, he says, first of all, Nolan's story has changed completely since we first discussed the early results. Then he was ecstatic that he had made one of the big history-making discoveries. And despite his strong interest on that day, after that, we never heard from him again. And he goes on to say, if this were my data, and I did the same analysis, my first conclusion after seeing so many mutations with coding regions, including lots of mutations never before seen in any medical database, this is critical, would be to think most of all that such mutations took place after the mummy died. In other words, they are not mutations, they're damage to the DNA due to the 100 to 500 years of environmental exposure, which is unavoidable. I would venture to say that the vast majority of molecular biologists would consider that as a primary hypothesis. Now, what Nolan and his colleagues did next was quite surprising, to say the least. They chose to interpret all of those many extensive mutations within DNA coding regions as genetically significant to the mummy while it was still alive. If it were a fresh, modern, undamaged sample, this might be reasonable. However, for a sample which has been moderately damaged to the extent described, it is not a plausible hypothesis. Now, what he is saying in this, I'll translate this for you, is that we have a paper from 2005 or 2006 that was published in a peer-reviewed journal about what's called ancient DNA. And just so you know, ancient DNA does not mean a mummy from Egypt from 5,000 years ago. And this is the paper. We have tweeted this out because this is an emergency of the first order of magnitude of scientific problem. And if you look at it, the date, what does the date say? 2005 was when the research was done. It was released in 2006 and published. Now, in this paper, it's very technical. It goes into the fact that when you have, and I'll just explain this for the lay person, the persons who are not scientists. If something goes out in your yard and dies, and it sits there for 100, 130, 200 years, the DNA material will still be in the bones, which is where we got this material from, the bone marrow of the ribs. But because of the fact that it's not in a cryogenic lab like you do keep a human embryo when you're preserving them in a cryogenic setting, the